Okay, in this very initial video within the economics playlist of videos, we're going to talk about profit maximization. And this is really to get ourselves up to scratch with how companies decide on the optimal level of output, how many units, how many items to produce, how they interact with the demand function as supplied by clients. So this video is really important for your further understanding of what will happen sort of in later lessons. And when we discuss how companies make the decision or how companies choose to decide what level of output to produce in order to maximize their profits, we're going to do so under two possible conditions. So we will interchangeably be assuming, or we'll be changing the assumptions between conditions of perfect competition and imperfect competition. And in later modules, in later lessons and videos, we will have plenty of opportunity to discuss the features of both perfect competition and imperfect competition. However, for the benefit of this, very introductory lesson, I want to lay down some ideas. So without going into too much detail, perfect competition is when you've got many sellers or many producers. What they sell or produce is sort of very much interchangeable. There is no real way to differentiate the product. No product differentiation. Everybody's pretty much everybody's pretty much selling and producing the same thing. And very importantly, no single producer is going to be big enough to have any influence the price at which things are being sold. So very fragmented market in terms of the producer or seller side. Lots of individual small players, nobody big enough to really dominate or even be big enough to exert influence, meaningful influence over the price in the market. And this is, a bit of an ideal sort of condition. Very hard to find in reality, although you could say, and your book makes this claim as well, that in reality these types of conditions may, for example, be found in certain agricultural markets, commodities markets, for example, for wheat or certain other commodities. Well, yeah, okay, we don't have to worry about that. For imperfect competition, now, there are lots of different types of imperfect competition. There is monopolistic competition, there's the oligopoly, there's also something called the monopoly. And I think that final one is a good example of imperfect competition. And we're going to go with this monopoly, something that you may know as a board game. But monopoly means there is just one seller or one producer, and there are no substitutes for the products. You can't substitute it with anything else. Okay, so let's begin with that first situation. That is conditions of perfect competition. They are definitely going to be a little bit easier to discuss than imperfect competition, or imperfect competition is just that little bit more complicated. So perfect competition, you could imagine that we're, for example, talking about the wheat producing industry within the agriculture sector, and farmers producing wheat on relatively small farms, nobody big enough to dominate the whole sector. Okay, so I'm going to start off over here with drawing a very basic and I guess to many people well-known function or graph, whereby on the vertical axis we will have the price or P, and on the horizontal axis we're going to have the quantity that is being produced or being demanded by the buyers. And I'm going to start off by charting something that I'm going to call the aggregate demand function, meaning, how much of the product, what quantity of the product, in this case, it could be, e.g., like we said, wheat, some kind of grain, how much of the product people want to buy, which is going to be a function of the price. And we are talking about aggregate demand, not at an individual, household level. This is the whole market, the whole economy. And obviously, as price is potentially lower, quantity demanded should be higher. Wheat, after all, is one of those absolutely normal goods where the quantity is inversely related to price. Lower price, higher quantity demanded. So this is going to be our aggregate demand curve, or aggregate portrayal, graphical portrayal of aggregate demand. And how much people will actually want to buy will depend on the price. So if, well, actually, before I draw the price, it probably would have been sensible to have also drawn another function here to say, oh, this is the aggregate supply function. So aggregate supply, the curve has a positive slope. It shows that the quantity which producers are willing to supply is positively related to the price at which they can sell their goods. They want to produce more if they can sell for a higher price. And actually, maybe that wasn't a good point. But somewhere here there is that intersection of supply and demand, and that's the quantity which will be produced to provide equilibrium between the supply and demand side of the equation, and that is the price. So let's make this P star, the price in the market, the price as dictated by aggregate demand and its meeting place with the aggregate supply function. Now, very importantly, how does this aggregate picture impact on the situation of the individual producer? Right, so now we're zooming in or focusing on a single wheat farm or grain farm, right? Well, the thing is, because everybody in this market is selling the same thing, a very homogeneous product with really no capacity to differentiate. No one is big. No single seller is big enough to have an impact on the price. Everybody is going to be, all the individual producers are going to be price takers. They will simply take the price which exists in the sort of market, which is a function of aggregate demand and supply, and they'll be able to sell at that price without having the influence or ability to in any way shift it up or down by producing more or less. So, as you saw here, I made a horizontal extension or extrapolation of that line simply to show that at the individual producer level, we also have price and quantity, but now the point is, an individual producer is so small in a relative sense that it doesn't matter if they, use 1/4 of their acreage or hectares to produce wheat, or half of the available surface, or maybe the whole farm is planted with wheat. At the individual producer level, the quantity doesn't really impact price because each producer is so small. So given the price which exists in the market, a single producer can produce as much or as little as they want, and they will still be able to sell their produce at the price that is dictated by the market. Now, if a producer tries to sell their produce, whatever quantity, for a price that is higher than the price that persists in the market, they won't be able to sell. Why? Because everybody else is selling for a lower price. If they try to sell for a lower price than the market price, so this was higher price, this is lower price, then once again, it doesn't make any sense. Not because you wouldn't be able to sell, yes, you would, but you can just as well sell any quantity that you wish for a higher market price. So why bother trying to offer your produce for a lower price if you can sell everything you've got for that single market price? So an individual producer, whatever quantity they produce, they'll be able to sell it for a price that is a function of where aggregate demand and aggregate supply meet. They have nothing to do with this. They just take the price and produce whatever level. However, what is important is that this function, this horizontal line, which is obviously equal to P, is also the producer's marginal revenue. Every extra unit produced and sold generates additional revenue, marginal revenue, at a level equal to the price. Now you may think, well, that's quite obvious, but later on this will become quite important. And as a function of this, let me maybe put this over here. I wanted to ideally fit it down here, but I don't necessarily have the space. I'm going to draw one more chart which looks like this. So it's going to have price and quantity. So this is Q, this is P, but this time I want to focus on total revenue as experienced by the individual producer. So we're still looking at things from the individual producer's perspective, both here and here. And obviously, if we start off over here at a quantity equals to 0, well, they don't generate any revenue. But the point is, the more they produce, the more their overall revenue grows. And this is a linear function. So this is TR, total revenue. I know it's not an ideally straight line, but the whole idea is the more you produce, the more money you generate as revenue, as inflows. And it's a straight line with a constant slope. And that's the whole idea of this being a linear function. Let's now consider something similar, but this time under conditions of imperfect competition. And as I said before, imperfect competition may take the form of several actual market structures. Competition. I'm going to assume, e.g., that we're dealing with a monopoly. So a single producer, and the reason why this is a useful, let's say, assumption to make is that in a monopoly, the single producer which exists is the entire sort of supply side, the whole industry, entire industry. So what we do for an individual producer is going to be also applicable for the entire industry. Now, in this case, we're going to come across that problem which we already saw with the aggregate demand for an entire industry, even under conditions of perfect competition. And that was, if the industry wants to sell more, they need to reduce prices. That's what we had for the aggregate demand function. It was a curve, it was downward sloping, although at the individual producer level, that didn't translate into a downward sloping demand function. It was actually flat, it was horizontal. So here, let's play around with some numbers and make certain assumptions. I'm going to, over here, create a bit of a table. And maybe, for some of you, this is unnecessary because you already know it, but some of you probably don't. I'm going to think in terms of what quantity we as a monopolist in an industry can sell under different price scenarios. So if the price of a product is 100, maybe we can sell just 1 unit of it over some period of time. However, if we were to lower the price down to 80, maybe we would be able to sell 2 units. And, if the price were 60, this is very simplistic and primitive. Maybe the quantity sold could be 3, and so on. At a price of 40, it would be 4. And at a price of, what's next? Well, if this goes down linearly, then 20, and we would be able to sell 5. Great. Now, what would be our total revenue under these different scenarios? Well, if the quantity were 1 and we were selling 1 unit for a price of 100, then obviously total revenue would be 100, but over here it would be 160. And I'm just multiplying the numbers in the 2 columns. 3 times 60 would give 180, 4 times 40, 160, which is a number we've already seen over here, and 5 times 20, we're back to 100, which we saw when we were selling just 1 unit. Good. From this, we can calculate marginal revenues, something that I already wrote in the previous perfect competition example. I said this is MR, marginal revenue. So what's the extra benefit in terms of additional revenue of producing and selling an extra unit? Well, over here, going from an initial, I guess, assumed 0 to 1 means you're getting marginal revenue, additional revenue of 100, but then going from 1 to 2 brings additional revenue of 60. I'm including this side because with marginal revenue, it's actually quite important. It can be both positive and negative, as you'll see in a moment. Then, going from 160 to 180 total revenue as a result of increasing production from 2 to 3 brings in additional marginal revenue of 20. However, over here, this is the turning point. Going from 3 to 4 takes us down by 20. And over here, it's a downward movement by as much as 60. So, that's total revenue. And let me just say that over here, this price that we had here, this is the same as average revenue. If you're selling 5 units for a price of 20, that gives you total revenue of 100. So what's the average revenue? Well, you take 100 divided by 5 and you obviously get 20. Right. Why is this important? Because using this data, using this very simple example, I can plot charts like the ones we had just a moment ago for perfect competition in terms of their structure, but the shapes that we're going to draw are not going to be the same. I'm going to say price over here, so P, and Q, so quantity, Q down here. And let's actually be accurate. 20, 40, 60, 80, 100, and so on. And over here, the quantities involved, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. When the price is 100, we assumed the quantity sold was just 1. At a price of 80, the quantity sold was 2. And then at a price of 80, it was 3, and so on. So obviously, it's not perfect, but what I want to show you is that this takes the shape of a line, okay, more or less line, and this is our, demand curve, to be honest, for the industry, but also for the individual producer, because they are a monopolist. And you could say, well, this is the price function or the AR function, aggregate revenue. How much, average revenue, not aggregate. This A stands for average revenue, not aggregate. Average revenue that we get depending on the quantity produced, which is obviously equal to the price sold. So price at which we sell. However, I want to use this same chart to also plot on it marginal revenue. You may remember that in the previous one, where we had perfect competition, we drew a straight line for the individual producer and we said P equals to MR. Well, that was because the two lines were overlaid. Here, that's not going to be the same. At a quantity of 1, marginal revenue is 100, but then at a quantity of 2, it drops very much to 60, and then plus 20 only, and then it turns into negative 20. So that would be somewhere here if we extended this, to cover negative spaces as well. Negative 60 would be even lower, so maybe somewhere here. And when you plot the marginal revenue curve, or MR, you get a curve with a lot more steepness into it. The slope is much, much higher here, though it is a negative one to start with. So it's less gentle than for the aggregate revenue or price function. And this is an absolute feature of charts, which you will also find in the curriculum, charts which we will later be using to project certain decisions or estimate decisions or decision points for companies operating in conditions of imperfect competition. And one more chart which your book also shows is that if you want to plot total revenue on a graph where on one axis you've got price and on the other axis you've got Q, then, given the fact that we start relatively low and then we steeply move up and then slow down a little bit and then start falling, well, you could say, well, the total revenue without, plotting this using the actual numbers, if this was the level of 100 and this was the level of 180, so that peak moment with a quantity of 3, this would take this kind of arch shape. I now want us to focus on the cost perspective, because in the last, the previous couple of minutes, we were talking about revenue, be it average revenue or marginal revenue. Now let's think about the cost side of the equation. Okay, so when we discuss costs in economics, we will definitely be making the difference or differentiating between those costs which are of a fixed nature, so fixed costs, but also variable costs. Okay, so fixed costs are going to, for example, be the cost of making sure we've got access to physical capital. So things like a production plant or a facility or a shop, if we're selling stuff retail. Variable costs are obviously things like, for example, labor. labor is often considered a variable cost. That is one which we can quite easily and quite flexibly switch on and off, or increase and decrease. Now, in reality, that's not so easy given certain legal considerations and provisions of the legal code, labor code, etc. It's not so easy to hire and fire people. But, for the purposes of this let's say, example, and for the purposes of the concepts that we are illustrating here, that's going to be an absolutely fine assumption to make. Now, we're going to think about costs in the short run. And in the short run, at least some costs remain fixed. In the long run, it's possible to switch on and off all costs. If you are leasing a shop or leasing a production facility, it's possible to terminate the lease, or the lease term runs out and you don't prolong it, and you get rid of that fixed costs. But that's fixed cost, but that's a long run consideration. In the short run, at least some costs remain fixed. They cannot be switched off, and they cannot easily be increased. You're stuck with what you've got. In the long run, everything can be changed, but that's something we'll talk about in a subsequent video, not the next one, but 2 videos down the line, when we talk about long and short run costs, economies and diseconomies of scale. Okay, so just imagine for a moment, we've got a fast food joint, a fast food sort of shop or restaurant, if you may call it that, just a physical place next to a high street with a window through which customers are being served. So, that shop lease is going to be our fixed cost. And when you think about how that fixed cost translates into some kind of graphical representation, so as always, we shall draw a graph, a chart. On the horizontal axis, I want to have quantity, so Q, and on the vertical axis, let's have, this time, not price, but the cost per unit. Okay, so given that the fixed cost is born no matter how, what is the number of units being produced, well, that fixed cost will, if you divide by the number of units being produced, will become lower and lower on a per unit basis. And it will become, kind of negligible. Although in reality, what's the maximum quantity you can really produce within the confines of a single location? Now, let's come to the variable cost, that is the labor. Okay, if you've got one employee, that one employee is your single variable cost, but one employee is doing everything. They're preparing the food, they're taking orders, they're taking in payments, everything is being done by that one single employee. I'm sure it would be quite beneficial to introduce additional laborers, additional workers, so as to handle a bigger load. So if you want to sell more and you want to do it efficiently, think about how a proper fast food restaurant, well-organized one, is done, like a McDonald's or KFC or whatever, especially when you go through drive-through. There is division of labor there, and you're going to have more than one employee. One can face the client over here. Somebody else may be doing the food prep. Somebody else, this is the client. Somebody may be handing the order out to the client. Somebody's, taking the order. Or if you want to specialize even more, somebody may be prepping the meat, the vegetables. Somebody may be doing the prepping the packaging for the fast food. Somebody else will be taking care of the washing up of the machines or dishes or whatever, and so on. You can probably find additional functions. And somebody else will be doing posting on social media so as to attract customers, etc. Or maybe you'll have somebody standing in front of the shop even and kind of attracting customers in. Now, this allows you to sell more, obviously, but as you can probably imagine, or as you can, or as you know from experience, the simple fact that you're adding additional employees obviously means you've got additional variable costs. But the biggest increase in efficiency in terms of the output that the marginal output that an additional employees is able to bring to the company happens when you're adding those initial people. This is where you get the really big benefits of work specialization or division of labor. After that, the marginal increases are less and less and less. And if you've got that many people working together, maybe you'll just need one person in the middle to act as a coordinator to make sure everybody's working in tandem. And that person will not really be contributing to output at all, but they will be able to, help the others work by avoiding inefficiencies. So the idea is you can add extra variable cost, but the benefits in terms of increasing output will initially be big, but then will become smaller and smaller. And anyway, adding new people will actually, at some point, make it difficult to find additional people, and maybe you'll have to start paying them more and stuff like that. So what I want to draw over here, let me use, I'm just thinking about the right color. Right, I'm going to use a blue color. I'm going to draw a very important curve known as if this is, I didn't properly label, I talked about this. This is the average fixed cost curve. Average fixed cost, which obviously spreads over a large number of units. But the average variable cost, that's going to be my next curve over here. So it will take this kind of shape, like a smile. It's a very characteristic shape. Average variable cost, implying that initially, when you want to produce more and more and more, you keep adding additional variable cost elements, which is labor, but it also includes, the food produce, the raw materials, the raw ingredients being used here. And initially, because of those benefits of better division of labor, better specialization, you're able to lower your per unit cost whilst increasing quantity. But at some point, this, necessitates adding more and more people so as to produce more and more units. And actually, the cost on a per unit starts to grow because, for example, this coordinator isn't adding anything to output as such, but they are just coordinating the people without having a realistically meaningful impact on the quantity being produced. So at some point, average costs tend to grow. And when you combine both the average fixed cost and variable cost element, you get the average total cost, which at the beginning is just, the sum of these two things, which is quite high. But then over time, this falls and becomes closer and closer to the AVC, because the average total cost is really the sum of the other two lines. So this is average total cost, and that's AVC plus AFC, average variable cost and average fixed cost. That's what total costs are. They're composed of these two components, two elements. And as this becomes smaller and smaller, average total cost becomes only fractionally higher than variable cost. Now, if you had this in microeconomics at school, brilliant. If you didn't, now's your chance to kind of get acquainted with it for the purposes of the exam, because Later on, you'll need to understand these charts, or at least take them for granted. Let me to solve questions and answer questions. Now, let's just very quickly do a numerical example of this. Although it will not necessarily be, kind of perfectly in line with the shapes I drew here, it's very difficult to plot this without, graph paper or without using something like Excel. So quantity, obviously quantity being produced, and average total cost per unit. Okay. Well, if it's average, it has to be per unit, but didn't really need to add this per unit element here. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, let's have 7 potentially items in total, which doesn't go very well with this example of, serving food if you serve 7 hot dogs or something, but this could be 7 per minute or 7, over some very short unit of time. Look, this could be in thousands potentially on a per day basis. Right. Average total cost. We're going to start relatively high, just like here, we started really, really high, 100. But then assume that there is that drop, 70, for example, if you're producing 2 units, and maybe 50 if you're producing 30 units. And, I'm making this stuff up. It's not like, this doesn't come from any pre-assumed wisdom or knowledge. If you're producing 5 units, right, you can see this stuff falls, but the rate of the fall decreases. And as we increase quantity, the falls are not as spectacular anymore, and they kind of plateau, they even out the whole thing, the shape evens out, the curve evens out, or plateaus over here. So let's have something like 35 over here, 32 over here. That's going to be the very bottom, the lowest cost per unit, and back to 35. So, this could be that lowest point over here. So quantity would be 6, and this could be that level of 32, the cost per unit, whereas this is 100, and you can obviously see that this is not in any way drawn to scale. You can probably not even see this 100. I drew 100 over here, so let me say 100. Okay, because I kind of went out of my board here, the space on my board almost. Now, total cost. This was average total cost, but what's the total cost as such? Well, easy. 1 times 100 is 100. 2 times 70, 140. 3 times 50, 150. Then we've got 160. 5 times 35, that's a little bit more tricky, but it's 175. Then 6 times 32, 180 plus 12, that's 192, I guess. And then 7 times 35, let me be careful with this one. This is going to be 245, yeah. Okay. So, now, why am I doing this? Because I want to show you the marginal cost. How much additional cost does it entail if we choose to produce an additional quantity of the product? Now, obviously, going from 0 to 1 means, well, whatever is the cost becomes the marginal cost of the first unit. But then the second unit is just 40. Then, look, the growth over here from here to here is just a tiny little marginal cost of 10. Then you've got another, 10 over here. Sorry, this should be at this level. So this, 10 should be here. Then the marginal cost becomes 15. Then it becomes 17. And then it starts being quite big, because that's going to be 45 plus 8. That's going to be 53. Right. Okay. If we wanted to show the marginal cost on this chart, let's use the color violet. No, violet I've got already. Let's use the color green. I haven't used this, so I'm going to make this green. What would happen is it would start relatively high, this marginal cost at 100, then it would sharply drop to a really low level and start to pick up. And something like that, more or less. Obviously, again, everything here is not drawn to scale, but you will often see portrayals of marginal cost or MC, or because this is the short run marginal cost curve, you may see this being depicted as the SMC. And the SMC curve in economics is quite important because in a moment we'll utilize it in conjunction with marginal revenue to make the decision about optimal output to maximize profit. But importantly, very importantly, it may come in handy. Even though my numbers and my graph don't really show this, because it's very difficult to show if you don't have graph paper and you're not very precise as well, is that this SMC crosses, or it collides and it passes through the ATC and the AVC at their respective lowest points. I know it's not visible in my chart, but that's what should happen. Well, I kind of did it, but it's not in line with the numbers. The only thing I needed the numbers for was to show you how the marginal cost curve drops really heavily initially and then starts to pick itself up and then starts to rise quite significantly a long way before we experience similar rises over here. You see, this still keeps dropping and dropping and dropping consistently and only then starts to slightly pick up, but there are drops. Over here, the marginal cost curve stops dropping somewhere here and then starts picking up in terms of the numbers. So this function, which I drew in green, although over here I had red, maybe that's a little bit unfortunate, once again, it does things earlier than average total cost, which was something similar to what we saw with marginal revenue and average revenue for the demand side of the equation. Now, let me also mention over here, because it is important, and it will also be stated later on a couple of times, that when we talk about the costs here in economics, costs in the economics section of the curriculum, or generally in economics, we mean both the sort of typical accounting costs, the ones you would find in a typical P&L as prepared by a company in its profit and loss, but also the opportunity costs associated with the individual factors of production for the factors of production. So, for example, if in order to set this up, you needed to expend some money to buy or lease equipment, facilities, etc., the cost is not just the lease itself, but also the opportunity cost of the capital that was engaged into this investment. What could you have earned otherwise? What kind of rate of return? And that's a different way to think about cost, because sometimes in economics later on we'll say, ooh, there is no opportunity to make a cost, but we mean no opportunity to make no opportunity, to make a profit, but we mean economic profit, which is not the same as accounting profit. And I'll try to be very clear when we talk about this to emphasize that point. You may recall that the title of this video was Profit Maximization, and we are now finally ready to jot down a rule which will allow us or a company to maximize its profit. And that rule is to keep increasing, so increase Q, the quantity produced, until our SMC, which is the short run marginal cost functional curve, meets with or equals MR, which you may remember is marginal revenue. And that's kind of to say, well, keep increasing output until the extra unit you want to produce costs you marginally in terms of additional cost, exactly the amount that you'll get in terms of additional revenue flow into the company from the sale of that unit. And there is one additional point here to make, and you'll see why we make it, and or additional condition, and the SMC, the curve, is rising. Why is this important? Well, let me show you. So let's analyze this profit maximization rule first for a company operating under conditions of perfect competition. So let's draw the classic chart where we're going to have price, but also alternatively the cost on a per unit basis. So price or cost per unit, and quantity Q over here. And absolutely kind of get used to the shape of those curves. Starting with costs, we're going to have the average variable cost like this. I'm not going to draw necessarily separately the average fixed cost, which you know would go like this. It would kind of flatten out over here. I'm going to, however, draw, that's very important, the average total cost, and it also it also takes the form of this smile. And the thing is, the difference between the two is actually the average fixed cost, which becomes smaller and smaller. Also, let's make sure to draw this one. This is the short run marginal cost curve. Let me make this a little bit thicker, that line over here. Good. And yeah, that's kind of the three curves, cost associated curves, that you should absolutely be familiar with. Please note that the SMC crosses through the ATC and ABC, well, at what should be their lowest respective points. Now, under conditions of perfect competition, remember the individual producer, who we are portraying over here, is a price taker. So they've got no influence on the price which exists or persists in the market. Now let's imagine that the price is relatively high. So let's say it's over here, nothing to do with the individual producer, price in the market. The price function over here is flat, is horizontal. But for a company operating under perfect competition, this straight line, the P line, the price line, is also the average revenue, and also the marginal revenue. Every additional unit that you sell or that you produce, that you output, brings you additional or marginal revenue equal to the same amount as the previous unit you sold, because you sell all your units for exactly the same equal steady level price. Okay, now P equals AR equals MR, it's the same thing. Now we said over here, increase Q until SMC equals MR. But as you'll see, the first time it happens is over here. But that's not the right level. We should keep increasing quantity produced until we find a moment where the additional cost of producing an extra unit intersects, equals the MR, the marginal revenue, and the SMC is on a rising trajectory, which would be over here. So the Q being produced, the quantity being produced, would in fact be over here. And given that we are selling all our units at this relatively high price, however, the average total cost of producing these units is lower. Okay, this territory, the difference between the price, also the marginal revenue and average revenue, minus, or this difference between the ATC and average revenue or price multiplied by quantity produced, would give us an indication of profit. So let me actually put this down over here. This is going to be the profit because average revenue or price is higher than average total cost, the cost per unit. And under conditions of perfect competition, this kind of profit would only be possible to achieve in the short run. Only possible in the short run. In the longer run, what would happen is additional competitors, producers would enter the market to capitalize on the existence of this profit, and they would eat that profit away. Why? Because as additional producers come in, not any individual one of them, but them in their entirety would push the aggregate supply or the quantity supplied accordingly down, up, and that would lower the price and eat away the profit. One of the things that you will find with perfect competition is that it's associated with very low barriers to entry, so it's easy for new entrants to come in when they spot the opportunity to make a profit. Now, over here, let's complete the lesson and try to find the point that maximizes profit. You see, here we found the quantity that maximizes profit. It was at the intersection of SMC and MR. Under conditions of imperfect competition, e.g., a monopoly, things work in exactly the same way. It's the same rule. It's just that our charts are a little bit different. And here you have to go back and combine these cost charts together with the revenue charts that we drew at the very beginning. So let me remind you what all of that was about. We're going to have price, or P, or the cost per unit. And over here, the quantity. And just like before, so this is Q, that's a little tail over here. Same cost charts, right? These absolutely don't change. We've got an AVC chart. We've got an ATC chart. I'm not going to go on about the shapes. You should know why they are like this. And we've got an SMC, short run marginal cost chart. That's the same. It doesn't matter what kind of company we are facing, or what kind of, whether it's perfect or imperfectly, in a perfectly or imperfectly competitive market. But this time, the demand function, the price, will not be facing an individual producer, will not be a flat line, i.e. you can sell and produce whatever quantity and still sell it for the same price. It's not like that. You will hopefully remember that in the case of, for example, a monopolist, their price as a function of quantity being produced or sold will look something like this, right? So the price or average revenue curve is downward sloping. If you want to sell more, you have to offer a lower price. And we also drew, on top of that, a curve for, or a straight line was actually, marginal revenue, MR. And it actually, in our previous examples, at some point became negative. Now, the rule is the same. So this is a negative, right? Keep increasing quantity produced, so keep pushing this way until your SMC, oh, that's the green one here, meet the MR or marginal revenue, at this point, it doesn't merit going anymore. It doesn't make sense because the extra unit that you'll produce and sell will bring about lower additional revenue, not just from itself, but from the fact that you have to lower the price at which you're selling the previous quantities as compared to the additional cost that this brings about. It just doesn't make sense. The additional cost is higher than the additional inflow of revenue. So stop over here and produce this quantity. Now, in terms of the profit we will generate, okay, this will, or actually in terms of the price, we will actually at this quantity offer our products for the following price. So that's going to be the market price. And, the thing about a monopoly market price is it's always a little bit high, and the quantity produced is always a little bit lower. That's typically the rule of monopolies. And once again, we will be able to highlight the area of profit because we're selling for this price to our clients. That's supposed to be a very unneat star. And at the same time, we're producing this quantity. The price is this much, the average total cost is this much on a per unit basis. So this represents our sort of area of profit. However, unlike before, I'm not going to say that this is going to be only a short-run phenomenon. No, this, in a monopoly, the profit may persist over the long run. Why? Well, because you don't have the threat of new entrants. In a monopoly, typically the barriers to entry are so high that it deters additional players. There's no space for additional players, and you can reap these monopoly profits unless the industry gets regulated, which often happens by an external sort of government-appointed regulator who sets prices for the monopolist to make sure they're not as high as would naturally be the case. Right, so that's enough for profit maximization. Hopefully this was a good overview or summary of what you need further on to appreciate the later lessons in this section of the curriculum.